So we're starting a new series, and we'll talk a little bit about why we called the series what we're calling it. It's called You, Me, and Empathy, and we'll get into that in a second. But the story behind this is last fall. I was browsing at a bookstore, like I like to do, and I remember I just you just sort of wander, and I found myself in the religious section, and of course in it's mostly Christian books, but there's other stuff in there as well. But the Christian section in most bookstores in Oklahoma is probably the largest section, and so I was just sort of like scanning titles, and a lot of these are books that I read either in college or in seminary. So there's like C.S. Lewis and Brennan Manning, and then like in the midst of all these books, like these classics, these standards of like early 20th century like Christian thought, there's one in there, and I won't say the name of the author or the title of the book, but basically the premise of the book, it was written by a modern day political pundit, and the premise of the book was empathy is bad. And that obviously that was not the title of the book, but it was close. But basically, the entire premise of the book is empathy is a bad thing in many circumstances. And so, like again, I'm looking at like C.S. Lewis, Brennan Manning, like all these like giants of Christian thought, and then I see this one, and I think like, oh, one of these things is not like the other. And so I picked it up and I started flipping through it. I did not buy it because I didn't want to provide funds for this particular project, but I flipped through it just thinking like, what argument could possibly be made for this title? And maybe it's just like a provocative title, and what it does is it like flips it as you get through it. It doesn't. It stays very consistent throughout the book. So I looked through the book and I read a few pages, and the argument is basically this. It is people often do things that are wrong. And the book, of course, tied all of the moral wrongs listed with the author's political positions. Amazingly, all of the things that this author believes are wrong are also the things that this author promotes as a political pundit. So it's perfectly aligned. So it worked out really well for this person. So So the argument is, okay, people do things that are wrong, and when they do those things, you should not feel empathy for them. So if somebody is in disagreement with you, and then they suffer, and their suffering is in any way connected to the fact that they are in disagreement with you, then they do not deserve, nor should you offer them empathy. That is the overall, and I realize like I'm oversimplifying like what is like stuffed inside of an entire book, but there are other arguments inside of it. But that is, if I was going to summarize the thing in like one paragraph and as good a faith as I can. So basically, and like if you wanted to kind of break it down a little bit more, one of the like the sub arguments is like people become weak or morally compromised by empathizing with the wrong people. So basically, like if I empathize with somebody that I am in moral disagreement with, I then become like culpable in like moral compromise. You know what I mean? And so that is again that's sort of a high view of what the argument is. So basically, it's arguing like if you're going to have empathy for people, they better be the right people, and it better be for the right reasons. And of course, because I do this, like there's always a part of my brain that's looking for like things that we should be talking about here on Sunday mornings. And so I texted Ashley like immediately, and I texted her a copy or a picture of the book cover, and I said, this maybe is a thing we should be talking about. And she was not surprised at the subject of the book, nor the person who wrote it. And so as we sort of talked about it a little bit more, we thought, well, maybe this is a good idea to do a sermon series about look, there's lots of ideas and thoughts out there that do not deserve our time, nor do they deserve our attention. But often, like you hear things that bleed into things that are often couched as like political points of view or whatever, and sometimes they kind of bleed into the spirituality conversation, and they become points of theology that like Christian authors or pastors begin to position, and it becomes sort of this is actually beginning to encroach on how people think about Jesus and the people who follow Jesus, and that actually is very much our business. And so so the topic of conversation between Ashley and me became like, what if we decided to really just kind of unpack this and really kind of explore it, and not as a way to sort of treat it like a straw man and just like knock it down, but really kind of engage it as like, why is it that people have this point of view? And why is it catching on so much? Like, why is there like a war on empathy of all the things to go after? Like, why is empathy such a thing? And maybe and as we get into this, one of the things we'll do is we'll sort of define what empathy is, and maybe we're not really using it in the same way often. And so we're gonna talk about that. That is the overall. That is kind of the 10,000-foot view of what this series is going to be. Basically, the dominant question is. Is it possible that empathy is, at least in some circumstances, a bad thing? And if so, how do we know when it's the correct thing to do? And how do we, how do we avoid having bad versions of empathy, if that's even possible? So those are all the kind of the things that are swirling around what we're doing with this series. So I'm a parent. I have 3 kids, and as kids get older, and I'm sure every parent in the room can empathize with this, but as your kids get older and as they begin to sort of learn how the world works, just in both small and large ways, you begin to have this thought of, I never thought I would have to tell a person not to do that. You know what I mean? Like, no, don't grab the knife from that side. Like, or you know what I mean? Like, I never realized until this moment that someone has to be told not to do this particular thing because it seems so obvious, like, don't do that. And I'm not going to get into specifics because the kid who does this the most is in the room right now, and I don't want him to get embarrassed. And I don't want anybody like giving him a hard time, like, oh, you really thought that was a good idea, huh? Like throwing a brick in the air and just like watching it as it comes right back down. Like that didn't happen. He didn't do that. But I'm not saying I probably shouldn't tell him not to do that at some point. You know what I mean? And so if you're a parent and you have a kid who hurts themselves or who gets injured or ends up in a spot that they didn't want to be in, and they get really upset about it, there are 2 impulses, right? And they go right next to each other. And the first impulse, and maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm the bad person here, and everybody else is better than me. That's fine. Be morally superior. Do not empathize with me. But my first impulse when this kind of thing happens is, I told you so, right? Because what happens? Like, you tell a kid, don't do that thing. And then they go and they do the thing. And then they come back and they're angry and upset and crying. And they look at you like it's your fault that they're hurt now. And you're like, I did everything I could to keep you from ending up in exactly this situation. What did you think was going to happen? And so there's a part of you that feels a little satisfied, right? Like, oh, we've learned a very valuable lesson, as if they're not going to do it again. And so there's this like moral superiority that kind of encroaches in the brain that says like, yeah, like you should have known that was going to happen. That is life. That is physics. That is gravity, my friend. Welcome to it. So that is the first impulse. And the second impulse is probably the one that there's at least one therapist in the room, and I'm sure she's like taking many notes on me right now. And that I'm sure she would advise you to do, which is to get down at the kid's level and say, I am so sorry. That must be painful. I know that wasn't fun. And so you address the pain first, and then maybe after the bleeding has stopped, you have a conversation about like, now what did we learn? You know what I mean? And so again, there's those 2 dual impulses, and I would imagine, and again, maybe I'm the only bad parent in the room, but I would imagine that many of us have this sense of like, yeah, it's hard to feel empathy when I told you not to do that and then you did it anyway, and then the thing that I told you would happen happened. And so we often, and this continues to like expand into how we interact with everybody, right? So we often struggle with showing empathy towards other people, especially when we start from a posture of superiority or judgmentalism or like, yeah, what did you think was going to happen, right? And I'm not saying we're not right in those situations. I'm saying like, if that is my first response, then maybe I need to sort of check myself and begin asking questions about like, why is my first instinct to try to teach a lesson rather than to acknowledge the pain? You know what I mean? So it's not like this comes out of nowhere. This is actually, if you want to go looking through the scriptures, and we will, through for the concept of empathy and like where it shows up. And when I say empathy, just to sort of get us all on the same page, what I'm talking about is acknowledging and sort of sharing in the experience of another person, the emotional experience of another person. That's the broadest possible terms I can use. And so, and basically understanding it and seeing it through a human lens and not from a detached lens, like connecting yourself to the struggle rather than being detached from it and feeling sort of above it in some sort of way. Anyway, so in Matthew chapter 25, you have this passage where Jesus is talking. And again, this shows up a lot. We're going to look at several today. This is one of probably the more famous ones. In Matthew chapter 25, Jesus is teaching, and he says some things that sound weird. Not the only time that Jesus does this, but this is one of them. And so we'll just read it. So in Matthew 25, verse 31, It says this. Jesus says, when the Son of Man, which is a way that Jesus would often refer to himself, when the Son of Man in all his glory and all the angels with him, comes in all his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. So he's kind of painting this very broad picture of like, there will come a time when we all begin to sort of like realize what part we played in the story that's being told. And then in verse 34, it says, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick and in prison and go visit you? In other words, like, we appreciate that you're giving us credit for all these things. We just don't remember doing it. And then in verse 40, Jesus says, the king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. In other words, Jesus is saying, when you can recognize and engage with the pain of other people, you are encountering the divine in those moments. That for Jesus, empathy is directly connected to the experience of God in the flesh. And so not receiving empathy, showing empathy. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. He doesn't say, I was hungry because I wasted all my money on casinos or, or whatever. He says, I was hungry. He doesn't qualify it. He doesn't say, I was hungry for this reason. He says, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. Oh, so the experience of recognizing the hunger of another person and addressing it, empathizing with it, if you will, that is encountering God in the flesh, according to Jesus. So in other words, Jesus connects empathy with the experience of encountering the divine. So Jesus seems to believe that God is most present in moments when people show empathy towards one another. Interesting. So then there's another writer named Paul who writes to one of the early churches in the book in Rome. And so in this letter to this church in Rome, in the book of Romans, Paul writes this. In Romans 12, verse 14, Paul writes, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. So for Paul, to be connected and participate in this Jesus movement, it looks a lot like mourning with those who mourn and rejoicing with those who rejoice, to meet people in whatever experience they are currently having, to meet other people where they are, whether it is in a moment of joy or a moment of sorrow. For Paul, that is what it looks like to show Jesus to the world. In Galatians chapter 6, same writer, Paul says this. In Galatians 6:1, Paul writes, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore the person gently, but watch yourselves or you may also be tempted. And then verse 2, carry each other's burdens. In this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. What is another word for carrying another person's burdens? Empathy, maybe? So this is a totally different thing than seeing someone suffering and saying, well, I told you. What did you think was going to happen? Or, well, you should have just known better. Or I would never let myself get in a situation like that. They should have, hopefully they'll learn their lesson and have something better happen to them next time. Is that empathy or is that something else? Is that carrying each other's burdens? Is that rejoicing with those who rejoice and mourning with those who mourn? Or is that something else? Is that maybe self-righteousness a little bit? And so Paul is basically, he's directly addressing this. He's saying like, yeah, there is for sure an impulse towards feeling superior when somebody else is going through something that you've somehow avoided. And Paul is saying, that's great that you feel that way, but it's actually very harmful. And so it's not great at all. So Paul is saying, yeah, carry each other's burdens. So we empathize, and that is how we show the world what God is like. So this is how we experience the divine, by expressing and engaging with empathy. We give ourselves permission to withhold empathy by allowing ourselves to feel morally superior to the person who's suffering. And basically, the entire thesis of the book that I found in the bookstore was people are making bad choices, therefore you shouldn't empathize with them. And again, like we could have all sorts of other conversations about like, are those choices that the person is making bad, or are they just choices that you would not make? You know what I mean? Because there is a difference, and so and that becomes the premise of the entire book, which is, yeah, if somebody's doing something and you don't agree with them, and then or if someone is engaging in some sort of reality that you don't like, and then there is suffering that is in any way attached to that, to show empathy to that person is wrong, is the argument that the book is making. And I think Paul is saying, like, how is that carrying somebody else's burdens? Like in no way is that connected to what Jesus or Paul is trying to say. So maybe, by the way, maybe that is why right after Paul says the whole mourn with those who mourn part, right after that, what does he say? He says, don't be proud. Maybe pride and self-righteousness are the mortal enemies of empathy. And so we tell ourselves that we're better than the person or the people who are suffering, which gives us full permission to not express empathy, because you shouldn't have done that in the first place. I told you so, right? And so Paul, right after he says mourn with those who mourn, he says, do not be proud or conceited. Why? Because Paul knows that the best way to keep you from mourning with those who mourn is to make you feel superior to the person who is mourning. So there's very famously, if you want to talk about suffering, which who doesn't want to talk about suffering, but there's the most famous part of the scriptures that addresses suffering is the book of Job. And in the book of Job, there's a whole kind of long setup, but basically the setup is this. There's this guy named Job who has been declared a righteous person in the eyes of God, and Job begins to suffer. And so the whole question of the book of Job is, how will Job respond to his own suffering? And how will the people around Job respond to Job's suffering? And so at a certain point early in the book, after Job, and Job has lost everything. Job's business, his life has kind of fallen into total disrepair. His children are dead. His all of his resources are gone, and so he has nothing. And so at this point, he has some friends show up to recognize and to address the fact that Job is suffering. So in Job chapter 2, verse 11. It says this. It says, when Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, which, anybody trying to pick baby names now? Because I got some ideas for you. And you got to use the whole thing. You can't just call the kid Eliphaz. You got to call the kid Eliphaz the Temanite Johnson, or whatever the last name is. So when Job's three friends heard about all the troubles and all the things that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and to comfort him. So they all get together and they say, Job's having a hard time. Let's go visit him. Let's go see if we can cheer him up. And so in verse 12, it says, when they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat, which are signs of significant grief and mourning. So, and notice, by the way, nothing has happened to these guys, but when they see their friends suffering, what do? They take on the physical attributes of someone who is also suffering. So then in verse 13, it says, then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. So later, if we were going to do a whole study on the book of Job, which we totally should because it's very interesting, but if we were going to do a whole story or a whole study, you would see that later on in the story, Job's friends begin to speak. So here, they don't say a word. For 7 days and 7 nights, they dress themselves as Job is dressed. They tear their clothes, and they sit and they weep, and they stay silent for 7 straight days. So later, they begin to talk. And they're going to get very judgmental with Job, and they're going to get very preachy, and they're going to start telling him all the reasons that they think he's suffering. Well, there's one part where one of them says, well, basically it's like, I don't know how you did it, but you really upset, you made God mad, and God is punishing you. And so that is the position that one of Job's friends takes, and they begin to sort of lecture him on, here are all the reasons why you're suffering. And they tell him, well, you should have done this, and if you had done this, you would not be suffering now. And then at a certain point towards the end of the book, not to spoil the book of Job, but God shows up in person and basically tells all of Job's friends that they're wrong. And he basically tells them, like, you all should have kept your mouths shut. You owe Job an apology. And if Job forgives you, maybe I'll forgive you too. That's literally in the Bible. And so the position that God takes in the book of Job is when you try and tell somebody why they're suffering and you try and like lecture them and shame them and take this morally superior position about it, like it's not going to go great. And so, but before they do that, up to this point, all they've done with him is sit on the ground and grieve with him. Now, this out of this story, this creates a new tradition in ancient Judaism, which continues to this day. To this day, if you were to know somebody who was a practicing Jewish Orthodox person, and they had a family member who died, you would possibly go to their home or go to wherever the grieving is happening, and you would sit with them. And they call it sitting Shiva. Shiva is Hebrew for 7. And so what it means is literally you sit with the person. You don't speak. You don't rationalize. You don't try and cheer them up. You just sit with them for 7 days and 7 nights for 7 24-hour cycles. And it is a way of kind of re-engaging this story. You sit Shiva with this person. You have to really be careful how quickly you say that. But you sit with the person who is grieving, and you just sit with them and you stay silent. And you mirror whatever grief that they happen to be experiencing at this moment. So up to this point in the book of Job, that's all they've done. And so when they start talking, that's when they get into trouble. But when they're saying nothing and they're just sitting and mirroring what Job is going through, that is powerful. In fact, I had a professor in seminary who, when we were looking through the story, he was talking about that and how the tradition of sitting Shiva was created. And he says about Job's friends, my professor said, their words were garbage, but their silence was brilliant. Why? Because the silence was an act of empathy. The silence was an act of joining in Job exactly where they met him where he was, and they reflected back to him the thing that he was already going through. So Paul says, mourn with those who mourn. Maybe that's what it looks like. Maybe when we show up and we encounter somebody who is struggling and who is suffering, and our first impulse is to change the subject. Or our first impulse is to try and lighten the mood or to try and minimize it. Like, well, it could have been worse or something like that. Maybe we try too hard to say the right thing. And maybe instead we should just sit and be with the person. Maybe sometimes our words could be a lot better, but our silence could be brilliant. So, by the way, going back to what Paul says earlier in Romans, where he talks about mourning with those who mourn, notice he also says, rejoice with those who rejoice. This is kind of just an aside, but rejoicing with those who rejoice, that means our capacity to connect with others and to empathize isn't just about how we respond to their suffering. We often connect it to suffering because that makes the most amount of sense to us. But empathy can also show up in how we respond to joy and to success. So, like, for example, if you have ever been in a conversation with somebody and you had some good news to share, and maybe it was, hey, we just made our last car payment, and so now we can start saving for that big vacation we've been wanting to take. And then the person you said it to looks at you and says, huh, must be nice. Is that empathy? Is that rejoicing with those who rejoice? Like, what do you even say to that? Like, yeah, must be nice. That's not empathy. That's something else. And so what Paul is saying is, yeah, that's not healthy. It's not helpful. We are encouraged and we are called to meet people where they are. Sometimes it looks like rejoicing with those who rejoice, and sometimes it looks like mourning with those who mourn. Let's look at something else that Jesus says. So in Matthew chapter 22, beginning in verse 34, it says this. It says, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together, and these are different factions of like people with religious power. And then in verse 35, it says, one of them, an expert in the law, tested Jesus with this question. Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? Which, by the way, is not an unusual question to ask a rabbi in the first century. This is a conversation that was happening constantly in and around this period of time. And lots of rabbis had different types of answers to this question. There were some rabbis who, if you asked them, what's the greatest commandment? They would say to observe the Sabbath and to keep it holy. Some would say to give to the poor or something like that. So this is not an unusual question to ask. So this person is asking Jesus this question, but we're told by the narrator that he's being asked this question as an attempt to sort of like kind of pull apart Jesus's what he's up to. So in verse 37 it says, Jesus replied, love. So the question is, what's the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and prophets hang on these two commandments. So Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. The as yourself part seems pretty significant, does it not? How do I think and feel about my own suffering and my own experiences in life? And then now that once I know that, should that also inform how I think about the suffering and the joys of other people? Should how I respond to my own situation inform how I respond to other people's situation? Again, there's got to be a word for that, right? Is it empathy? It might be empathy. So Jesus is saying, when asked, what are the two greatest commandments? One is love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. The other is basically, in a word, empathize. Love other people like you are inclined to love yourself. In other words, encounter the joy and the suffering of other people as if it were your own joy and suffering. The entire Bible is drenched in a call towards empathy. So we're running. I don't want to go too far over time, but I'm going to tell you a story, and I am not the hero of this story. I don't like myself in this story. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that right now. So as I tell you this story and you begin to judge me, I have already been there. I agree with you. Whatever negative opinions you gather about me based on this story, I'm with you. So when I was a youth pastor, I was a youth pastor for about 7 years at a church in Fort Worth, and we had we had two big events every summer. One was camp, which was on like different college campuses, and the other was like a mission trip where we would go to a smaller church in Mississippi and just do like manual labor for them for the week. So the mission trip was usually kind of seen as like a big deal for whoever got to go, and there were lots of certain criteria because to go on this trip was basically like there's a lot of responsibility to it. You're going to be like left alone or with another student to like do work, and you're going to be trusted with a lot of stuff. So you have to demonstrate that you're very responsible. So one of the rules of being allowed to go on the mission trip is you have to not have been sent home from another event in the last 12 months. This is a rule that predated me. So we went to camp a couple of weeks before the mission trip was supposed to happen, and on like the third or fourth night of the camp, one of the women sponsors came and found me and said, "Hey Rob, this is a really hard thing to tell you, but there's one of the girls, and for the purpose of the story, I'm going to call her Jane. Jane has drugs. She brought like some drugs with her to camp. We found them on her, like we caught her using them in the bathroom, and then somebody else found more in her suitcase. And so we have to call her. Like the rules are very clear. We have to call her mom, and she has to be picked up. So we call the mom, and we pick, and the mom, and she's very, very embarrassed, and she drives. It's like a 3-hour drive from Fort Worth to come get her kid, and so she picks her up and she goes home. Now, a couple of weeks later is this mission trip, and the girl Jane was signed up for the mission trip. Now, everybody knows you're not allowed to go on the mission trip if you've been sent home from camp. So again, I didn't make that rule, but so I had to tell Jane's mom, hey, she can't go on the trip. We'll refund your money. Like I don't want there to be any sort of like tension on that front, but we are not allowed to bring her on this trip. So the mom was not taking no for an answer. And so she starts to call me at home and in the evenings. And at first at the first phone call, I was like, look, I'm really sorry. There's really nothing I can do. The third, fourth, fifth phone call, I began to get very short-tempered. I'll say I got really annoyed, and I was and I basically said like, look, if she hadn't made such a decision, then we wouldn't be talking about this. There's nothing I can do. You need to stop calling me. And so and here's the thing though, I wasn't wrong, right? And again, like the policy was out of my control. Like she was calling me, like there was nothing I could do. But at the same time, at a certain point, I lost empathy for this mom. And what I didn't see until years later was this mom is so desperate. And then when she's calling me, what she's really trying to say is, how am I going to help this kid? Like this is because I found out later, like this kid has been like expelled from school for the same reason. She's like lost all kinds of friendships. She's had a really, really hard time. And this was like the mom's last attempt to find something positive in her life. And she was basically hearing this youth pastor tell her, like, no, she's not welcome. And so, and again, I couldn't do anything about the rule, but I could have listened a little harder. I could have been a little bit more compassionate. I could have offered the mom like other resources and other opportunities to maybe like pull the kid back in. But it became sort of like I got so annoyed and I got so frustrated that it just became like I really want this family to just go away. And I'm not proud of that. That was a low point for me as a youth minister. And I look back and I realized like the thing that I am most embarrassed about as a youth minister was born out of my inability to express empathy for this person. So all that to say, like I feel like this is a thing. This is a thing that we all. I say I don't want to universalize it, but basically, I think it is really easy. Let's say to give ourselves permission to withhold empathy from other people because again, we feel above it. We feel like, well, she shouldn't have done it. But at the same time, like, yeah, but can you hear the pain? Can you hear like what got us to this moment in the first place? And why is this such a desperate moment for this parent? And I was not able to experience that like I should have. Like I wish if I could go back and get a do-over, I think I'd like to try a little harder to hear what the mom was actually trying to tell me. And so empathy is difficult. It's not always my first impulse, obviously. And I know a lot of us really struggle with it. And rather than acknowledge that, yeah, maybe this is something I could grow in and get better at, we tell ourselves, well, no, when you empathize with the wrong person, that's wrong. And so what that does is it lets us off the hook. It gives us permission to not do the work of being better. And so we named this series "You, Me, and Empathy," and it's we borrowed the title from a children's book by Janine Sanders and Sophia Cardoza. This is the cover. And if you find it at a bookstore, it doesn't have all the lines running through it. That's just us. So, but this is the cover of the book. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. And so it's a book to teach small children how to express and feel and show empathy. And then there's a poem in the front cover of the book, and I'm going to read you the poem. It's going to be up. And the poem says this: sometimes I feel just like you. I understand what you're going through. Sometimes you feel just like me. That understanding is called empathy. So basically, you can find this book in the children's section of that same bookstore where I found the other book. So basically, if you want to learn about empathy, don't go to the Christian section of the bookstore, go to the children's books. Why do small kids have a better understanding of the value of empathy than tens of thousands of American Jesus followers? How did that happen? And so this discussion, I think, raises a lot of questions, and I realize we're running very short on time, so I'm just going to hit those questions as quickly as I can. But first, we're going to talk about there are certain barriers, let me say, between us and empathy. And I think a lot of these are things that we set up for ourselves in one way or another, intentionally or unintentionally, that basically, again, give us permission to not express or experience or engage with empathy. So there are 3 barriers that we're going to look at just real quickly. The first, and we've talked about this a lot already, is moral superiority. When I feel superior morally to a person who is suffering, I'm giving myself permission to not validate or experience or share in their suffering. Well, they shouldn't have done that. What do you want me to do? So but here the thing is, you don't know what somebody else is going through. You don't know the situation that got this person to this moment. Just like I didn't know when that mom was calling me. You don't know the totality of another person's experience. And that lack of knowledge often gives us permission internally, or it gives us the ability to give ourselves permission to just withhold empathy, because for all we know, we're better than them. And so how we talk about people and how we think about people, if we take a position of moral superiority, again, what that does is it gives us permission. We are giving ourselves permission to withhold empathy from other people. So, and I realize this is a hot topic right now in our country, but it would be ridiculous for me not to acknowledge it. How we talk about people who are entering the country right now, and if they're not going through what is often described as the right way or the correct way to do it, and you will hear people ask the question, why can't they just do it the right way? Why can't they just follow the rules? Versus maybe the more helpful, empathetic question, which is, what are they running from? Or what is causing people to feel so desperate that this is what they've decided is the best thing to do right now? One posture exhibits moral superiority, the other posture expresses empathy. In the 80s and 90s, when I was growing up, there was the probably the big deal or one of the big situations happening in the world was the AIDS epidemic. And so there were lots of people who were dying of AIDS, and it was new enough that there was lots of fear and a lot of confusion. By the way, there's an incredible documentary that will just rip your guts out. It's called How to Survive a Plague. It's just about that period of time, and so people were dying, and people were suffering, and people were afraid. And when asked by like when a when an elected public official was asked, can you do something, can you in any way help us, the answer was, well, don't do the thing that gives you AIDS. Like literally, that was the answer. And looking back, this type of response should have humbled us, it should have grieved us. This is not carrying each other's burdens. This is like, well, look, if you don't if your life doesn't mirror my life in all the ways that I think it should, you're on your own. And don't ask me to feel sad for you, is the response. There are certain faith traditions who this is how they respond to mental health struggles. If you grew up in a church that was basically like, well, if you had more faith, you wouldn't be sad. Like, yeah, I don't know that that's going to help right now in this moment. So we imagine oftentimes when we have these kinds of conversations, we imagine there's some kind of meritocracy when it comes to suffering. And we know that that's not really how things are. That people suffer, people go through difficult situations, people have experiences that harm them and change them forever. And more often than not, those things happened regardless. That those things were in a lot of ways, out of their control. And for us to take some sort of moral superiority position over it and say, well, I would never find myself in that situation. Like, yeah, that doesn't that is a disconnecting statement. That is not carrying each other's burdens. That is not mourning with those who mourn. So that's the first barrier, is moral superiority. The second is lack of connection. It is easy to assume that something isn't a problem when it's never been a problem for you. It's easy, again, feels like an elephant in the room, but it is easy for a white person who mostly spends time with other white people to naturally assume that racism is not a real problem because they've never experienced it as a problem. So lack of connection creates what psychologists refer to as an empathy deficit. So basically, like, if I've never actually seen the problem and experienced the pain that is born out of that problem, then it must not be a problem because my experiences are the only real experiences. It's sort of like the subconscious message that we send ourselves. And the more time we spend learning the stories of other people, the deeper our capacity for empathy will be. Lack of connection is an empathy killer. And so the answer is not to retreat and go inside of our bubbles and to say, like, well, empathy is bad because the people who are experiencing pain aren't like me. Maybe it's the better question is, like, what am I not experiencing? What have I never seen or ever experienced that is keeping me from being able to feel this, to experience this with this person? So lack of connection, bless you, um, is a big barrier to empathy. And then the third barrier is fear of culpability. And this is a tough one, and we'll return to the question, the racism question that I mentioned before. Sometimes we resist the need for empathy because often subconsciously we worry that empathy would require that we do something different in our own lives. We don't want to change, so we naturally withhold empathy because we don't want to be confronted with all the ways that we might need to engage the larger problem. So, like, if I acknowledge maybe there is still a racism problem in our country today in the year 2026, then the next question I have, as a person who tries to do the right thing, the next question I have to ask myself is, am I benefiting from it? Am I participating in it? And what would I have to do different to make things better? These are hard questions, and people don't want to ask them. And so we are so afraid that by acknowledging something, we are claiming responsibility for it. And so we would rather totally deny that it exists at all rather than just engage it as a real thing. Or another dimension of this is if you happen to be an employer and there are people in your like who report to you, whose paycheck you are responsible for, and you continue to hear, we are not paying our people enough. It is one thing to say, oh no, like, are the people who work here not able to make a living wage versus, well, they should just spend less money, right? Like, yeah, that is a very easy position for someone to take who is making the most money. You know what I mean? So but again, it's fear of culpability, because if I acknowledge that there is a pay discrepancy in this organization that I am partially responsible for, then I have to do something about it. So because we fear culpability, we cannot empathize, because to empathize puts us on the hook for doing something about it, and we don't want to. So there are two questions I want to close this with. These are not my questions. These came from Brene Brown, who would have given a much better sermon on this than me, had given the opportunity. So question one is, how does this person see the world? If I am struggling to empathize, if there is a person or a group of people whose point of view I cannot get there with, how does this person see the world? This is perspective taking. This is asking questions about, what do I not see that this person sees? What do I not experience that this person experiences every single day? And then the second question is it possible that this person is actually doing their best? And the position of this is staying out of judgment. Is it possible that I don't know the situation? Is it possible that this mom who keeps calling and calling and calling, she's doing her best? She is fighting tooth and nail to do something good for her kid. And again, it's really, really hard to do that, because it requires time, it requires attention, it requires emotional engagement, and that's really, really hard to offer. So we're going to take communion in a second, and I want to invite the ushers to go ahead and start passing out the communion cups. If you want to take communion with us, you're welcome to. If you don't want to, that's totally okay. So as we prepare for that, as we sort of posture ourselves towards receiving communion, may we never dismiss the Bible's call towards empathy. May we recognize that empathy is, it's not just like a garnish that shows up on the side dish of a lot of the teachings of Jesus. It is the central, like, main part of a lot of what Jesus has to say. May we never dismiss the Bible's call towards empathy. May we resist the posture of moral superiority. May we seek connection. May we overcome our fear of culpability in favor of recognizing and acknowledging the struggles and the suffering, and sometimes the successes and the triumphs of the people around us. May we rejoice with those who rejoice, and may we mourn with those who mourn. May we never take a position of empathy is bad because I don't want to.